The UN Security Council convened an emergency session. The world was not just witnessing a crisis in Venezuela, it was watching a US president act as if international law did not exist. Trump personalized power, dismissed institutions, and treated the law, whether domestic or international, as something that mattered only when it served him. China's ambassador warned that if such actions became the norm, the entire international security system would collapse. In a rare moment, China stood at the UN podium to speak about respect for international law, while the US was the one being condemned. Russia did not miss the opportunity. Moscow's representative went beyond criticism and turned to mockery. Russia said bluntly, "This is exactly the so-called rules-based order the US once used to lecture the rest of the world. When rules are applied selectively, sooner or later they come back to bite the one who created them." But the strongest blow to Trump did not come from rivals. It came from the silence of allies. No NATO country stood up to defend the US. No speech argued that Trump's actions were necessary or justified. That silence said everything. Even America's closest partners were unwilling to attach their names to this decision. Denmark was among the rare allies to speak, but not to defend Trump. The Danish ambassador emphasized a basic principle: national borders are inviolable. No country has the right to threaten or use force against the political independence of another state. Through his actions in Venezuela, Trump turned those threats from bluster into something credible. When a US president is willing to detain another country's head of state, no one can dismiss statements about Greenland or Canada as jokes anymore. The peak of criticism came from the United Nations itself. The Secretary General's message, read before the Security Council, carried an unusually stern tone. The UN expressed deep concern that international law had been ignored. The use of force against a country's territorial integrity and political independence is absolutely prohibited. There are no exceptions for law enforcement. There are no exceptions for great powers. The United Nations acknowledged that Venezuela is in crisis, but stressed that a crisis does not give Trump the right to grant himself authority to act outside the law. The solution must be dialogue, not the kidnapping of a head of state. As the world condemned him, Trump did what he does best: deflect. He posted again about alleged fraud in the 2020 election, shared old images and old conspiracy theories, as if trying to drag America back into its internal political war to obscure the diplomatic failure unfolding in front of it, outside the US. However, no one was fooled. The world saw clearly. This was not an act in defense of democracy, but a display of personal power. Not the protection of the law, but its destruction. Not global leadership, but contempt for the very order the US once helped build. From that moment on, a question began to haunt the international community. If Donald Trump could do this to Venezuela, where would the next limit be? Immediately after the Security Council meeting, one thing was obvious. The US had stripped itself of its moral advantage. For decades, Washington built power not only through its military, but through the claim that it stood for rules. Donald Trump destroyed that foundation with a single decision. When the US condemns Russia over Ukraine, the answer now is Venezuela. When the US criticizes China over sovereignty, the answer is still Venezuela. No long debate is needed. In simply mentioning that Trump detained another country's head of state and called it law enforcement instantly nullifies Washington's moral arguments. This is not a media failure. This is a strategic failure. Trump may see the United Nations as a secondary stage, but for the rest of the world, it is where the rules are remembered. And on that stage, the US stood alone. No allies defended it. No diplomatic shield existed. No one was willing to say Trump's actions were right, even if they disliked Maduro. This isolation does not come from hostility toward the US, but from a lack of trust in Trump. Allies understand that the issue is not Venezuela, but a president willing to act unilaterally, bypass institutions, and rewrite the rules to fit his personal political needs. Greenland is the clearest example of this fear. During Trump's term, remarks about taking Greenland were once dismissed as exaggeration, even absurdity. After Venezuela, no one is laughing. When a US president has proven he is willing to use force to achieve strategic goals, every threat must be taken literally. Denmark's strong reaction was not about Venezuela itself, but about seeing its own future reflected in that action. If sovereignty can be erased by labeling an attack a law enforcement operation, then any small country could be next. As long as a great power is strong and determined enough, Canada is not outside this circle of concern either. For years, Trump repeatedly referred to Canada as the 51st state. At first it sounded like mockery, then it became political messaging. Now it serves as a troubling reminder. Trump does not see borders as inviolable lines, but as issues that can be renegotiated through power. In Latin America, the reaction runs even deeper. The region has been a direct victim of interventions from Washington in the past. For years, the US tried to rewrite that history in the language of partnership and respect. Trump made no effort to hide it. He and his delegation spoke openly about resources, control, and interests that revived old memories, and distrust returned faster than ever. The irony is that Trump has always portrayed himself as a president of peace. In reality, he has introduced a new understanding of conflict, where war does not need to be called war. When a president can use the military to detain another country's head of state without Congress, without the United Nations, and without accountability, the concept of checks on power is severely eroded. At home, Trump and his allies tried to cover up the reality with a familiar narrative. They talked about drugs, borders, and the security of Americans, but they could not explain why ordinary Americans saw no concrete benefits. Prices did not fall, living standards did not improve, no new stability was demonstrated. The only clear outcomes were access to resources and a show of force. Trump also did not support the democratic path the international community had promoted in Venezuela. He sidelined elected opposition leaders and instead backed a figure willing to cooperate and guarantee economic interests for the US. This exposed the hypocrisy of the pro-democracy rhetoric. For Trump, and democracy has value only when it serves his interests. Alongside this came the familiar distraction strategy. Trump returned to the 2020 election, recycled old conspiracy theories, and pulled American public opinion back into internal disputes. When Americans argue about the past, they ask a fewer questions about the present. Why is their country being condemned by the entire world? But the world does not forget. In Asia, US allies are watching closely. Japan warned that challenges to the international order are increasing as major powers grow more willing to use force. In that context, Trump's actions do not strengthen alliances, they weaken them. No one wants to stand shoulder to shoulder with someone who is willing to tear up the rulebook at any moment. The farther one looks, the clearer the picture becomes. Venezuela is not the final target, but a test of how the world reacts when the US openly ignores international law, a test of whether allies dare to speak up, and a test of how far Trump can go without paying an immediate price. The Security Council session ended without a binding resolution, but the damage was done. US credibility was eroded, trust was damaged, and a dangerous precedent was set. In the end, the biggest question is no longer Venezuela, and no longer Maduro. The question is this: what kind of world will exist if Donald Trump or any leader with a similar mindset continues to define the law according to personal will? Because when rules exist only for the weak, and while the strong write their own, the international order does not collapse in a single day. It rots from within, and Venezuela is only the first sign that this is already happening.